school, I don't know in Colombia, but at Sciences Po, we give students 3-4 articles printed in an A4 legal matter, not within the newspaper, and we ask them their reception. And of course, when it's not printed in the newspaper, they don't say, if they don't know if it comes from Le Monde, from Le Parisien, from a professional, they cannot receive what they're reading. And believe me, I started being a journalist before the web existed, and I used to work for Le Monde.fr. I created it almost 20 years ago today. And really, the things that you struggle is that when suddenly you cannot imagine in what context you will be read, listening to, or seen, is something that absolutely changes everything. It's the publisher's context is a real context, and if I had time, I would have told you that the fake news in France took place in the legitimate media sites. They tried to, because they didn't have a source like Breitbart or something like that, they tried to invade Le Monde, Mediapart, or the place in the comments section in order to enter those legacy media sites to pollute them with fake news. And it took them a lot of times to react. It took Mediapart almost 24 hours, which on a digital era, it's a very long time until you realize that somebody on your site is publishing fake news within the comment section, or within the club section, or within the open blog section. But if I take that apart, the fact that you have a lot of fake news sources that are trying to contextualize differently articles coming from legacy media. And I mean, when you're a journalist, you always knew if your article was going in a front page, down below, somewhere, and it gave the hierarchy of information, and it put some colors to the agenda. Today, it's just you just throw something in the space because, of course, it's. Let me just take 30 seconds. The importance of Facebook. When you made your presentation, is that for some people, Facebook is the only source of information. And so I'm not worried about people my age having a lot of sources of information and receiving Facebook and being on Facebook as well. Because they have the news literacy, they have the context literacy, and they can wait a solution of another one. At the same time, I'm very worried when I see students 20, 21 years to 22 years old, and they get their news through Facebook and through their newsfeed, through a context that is driven by an algorithm and that is not driven by a public interest or even propaganda interest. Nobody controls really this context, and the context is different for everybody, so the conversation is absolutely impossible, because the exercise we do, and I think everybody does with the students, is always the same. The 2 first weeks, we ask them, some of them to like some things on Facebook, another group to like something else, and after 2 weeks, they compare what kind of news they receive through Facebook and affiliated sites. And those are 2 different visions of the world. It's not a problem when you rely on multiple sources. It is a problem when it's your only source of information. And so this is why they're working on what they say diversity indexes, that they try to put in the algorithm the fact that you will be at a moment exposed to the diversity of opinions. At the same time, Google works on things that said, how do you put serendipity in a search engine? So the computer science guys work not in order to shape the newsfeed, but to have some windows outside the world that shows that your context is not the only context anymore. And the loss of the context of the news is really something that I think separates 2 kinds of populations that are able to have a professionalized context or diversity context of the news, and the population that has its own context. And so whether we call it filter bubble or not, for professional is entering a context that don't matter. And this is why one of the biggest challenge for me, for journalists today, it relies in the tech, in the ability of entering this kind of context. This is just what I wanted to say.
I will just give it to Joanne. Joanne Oravec from Wisconsin. About another kind of fake news, in effect, the glorified press releases that are finding their ways into a number of newspapers, and I'm not talking about the New York Times, the Washington Post, Boston Globe, et cetera, but the more regional papers, again, with the newsrooms emptying, the staffs decreasing, people need to fill pages, and corporations are more than happy to fill in with some wonderfully well-written story about a recent drug release or something like that. And I'm wondering if there's some way of identifying corporate content, the press release content. Again, bylines are wonderful. They are actually pretty rare in some of the newspapers that I'm thinking of. But again, do you see that this might be an increasing problem as the number of journalists producing stories for newspapers decreases?
A little bit. Yes, that's happening, and I think people, if you look at the strategic communication business today, if you look at your typical advertising agency or PR agency, you will see that there's a unit in almost all of those agencies whose job it is to produce. It is for news consumption, but it's obviously being done because there is an interest that they want you to think. They want to influence your thinking on that. That is, and so yes, you're right that this is a practice that's happening more, and it's happening in a more sophisticated way. But that said, there's an interesting counter to that, and that is there was always a tendency for news organizations, newspapers particularly, to pad their papers with press releases. I mean, that goes back. But that was in the day when newspapers were really fat and they had a lot of space they had to fill. So public relations people, they knew if they wrote an article, they would find a space for it. Today, and maybe this is ironic, because newspapers are thin, that territory, that space is far more valuable than it used to be. And I think what you find is that in news organizations that at least are mindful of their public obligation would be very careful to make sure that that valuable real estate is not filled by someone who's trying to influence you. So in some ways, I think the downside of what's happening to news media is offsetting what might be the proliferation here of paid-for news. But ethically, absolutely, if it is used, it ought to be labeled as such, and often it is.
I would like just to complement with two small examples. First, we're seeing that all those fact-checking elements now turn not into fact-checking, but in, how would I say it, source identifying. You know, so the way we track the meat, for example, in France, you know, you say this meat, the cattle was raised there and then slaughtered there and then transformed there. We're trying to develop this kind of instrument for news. So not judging if the news is fake or true, as if she should be believed or not, but give like a code and say, this is the story of this story. It came from here and here and here. And try to develop that on a technological way, so that you can have the same thing as you have a label when you buy a meat and says the cattle was raised here and that one. Develop those kind of things. And then the other problem is when Google makes an instrument available to the audience doesn't use it. Okay, so you cannot. I'm sorry, it won't be democratic to say that, but just to rely on the user to use that kind of instrument doesn't work, I mean, we can be sad about it, we can be happy about it, we can say it's democracy or not, just I realize it doesn't work. So the good money doesn't beat the bad money just because of the free market of ideas when we read. So you have a lot of people advocating now for those kind of computerized elements that would allow you at least to track the news history and that would enter this kind of feeds or platforms at the moment.
Hi, John Burmeister. I'm in philosophy at Boston College, and I have a question for Bruno about what's I've sometimes seen described as information literacy. And you've given a couple different examples of really wonderful exercises of how to walk students through, taking the newspaper article out of its context and reading it, or I think you were having them set up sort of fake Facebook accounts and then liking certain things. Mm-hmm. This seems really important to me for educating young people about just how to assess information. So I was wondering if you or others, your colleagues, have been working with educational institutions, whether it's high schools or colleges, because it strikes me that in terms of a liberal arts education, it might be really important for us to start thinking about having a requirement in college or in high school to how to process information intelligently.
I absolutely agree with you. Every time we participate to hearings, official commissions, I said we need reading classes for the information overload. That's all we need. What we call news literacy or whatever is just how to cope with the image and news overload. And I'm absolutely sure that really we have to educate people just to cope with the overload. What does it mean? But the only thing I can say with the political powers I've been discussing with is that they still think that news, I think for me that a part of the distrust of the media come because when really they were the technical gatekeeper, not only the philosophical gatekeeper, but you had an entry barrier at the market of information. When they published something, they made something appear. Now with the information overload, when you publish something and you're a legacy media, you made a lot of things disappear, which is not the same thing. Before you were a door to an unknown continent, which was the news. Now you give the impression that you're closing the windows to a whole continent of news, fake or whether or not, because you pick your own news. So really, this is a whole transformation about it. Right. And this is a transformation that is educational at the high school level. It's the same thing, I will just comment that. At the moment, I was responsible for program commissioning for the French public TV. And we had a debate about images. When the Charlie Hebdo attack happened, on Facebook and all over the places, you had the image of this policeman being shot by one of the terrorists. Terrible images. And the official regulatory body for the French TV and French radio prevented us not only from showing these images, but from letting know the public that these images existed. So how do you cope with a million of young people looking at this image on Facebook, and none of the legacy media having the right not only to publish it, which I can understand, but to talk about it? So it seems to me that the authorities still believe that media have access to something that people don't have access to. Whether the problem is how do you educate people to cope with image information overload? And then they will be able to understand the role of the media, not to make something appear, but to sort out, to tell stories between the truth and what is not the truth.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank our panelists one last time for a very wonderful panel, and thank you all very much.
I'll ask the panelists just to stay there for a moment and thank you again, and thank Ellen for her chairing the session. So we've now come to close to the end, and what I'd like to do is maybe just pick up on two quick threads that I heard mentioned: information overload and Megyn Kelly's experience of fright, so strong at Disneyland that she needed an armed guard. And this puts me in the thought of Karl Kraus, who was an Austrian editor between World War I and World War II. He was also a journalist and a satirist, and he said, and of course he said it in German, so I'll paraphrase it in English. He said that in his world there were two types of people: those who read what he had written and hated him and wanted to kill him, and the other type liked what he wrote, wanted to come to his office for a few hours and share their views with him about what he had written. He said, "The police will only protect me from the former." But on a more serious note, actually we are indebted to journalists as they pursue the truth, because they often do so, not often, but sometimes do so at great peril to their health and well-being, and to that of their families, people around them. And I think we all are grateful for their pursuit at the cost even of their lives. And I can't help but to think for another topic, another day, would be to look at the role of social media in either helping them get stories and protect themselves, or become more vulnerable as a result of social media. But we'll leave that for another day. I would now like to close things up, and I'll ask, even though there are probably several applause-worthy comments I'll be making, just to hold your applause until the end. First, I'd like to thank Michael Schudson for your generosity of coming here today, spending so much time with us, talking with us, and your very rich and fruitful remarks. And of course, I share my gratitude to the panel chairs and to all the paper contributors throughout the past 2 days for their rich and thoughtful contributions. Of course, I'm also grateful to the sponsors of this event, without whose support we wouldn't be here. And of course, that begins with the Andrew Lack, our trustee, who has made major funding available for this, and of course, Dean Tom Fiedler, who has been the supporter and encourager of this activity. Juliet Floyd and Russell Powell, my colleagues with the Mellon Foundation, we appreciate their support. The Feld family through the Division of Emerging Media, the Consul General of France in Boston, Monsieur le Consul Général Valéry Freiland. Please don't repeat my pronunciation of his name to him. And also to our helpers, Liz Crocker, Mimi Stith, and Allison Keir, as well as the students. So on that note, we can applaud the recognition and appreciation. So please join me. So I think now, just to say just a very few words about what we've done, I set forth yesterday morning a tremendously ambitious agenda to try to cross chasms of disciplinary specialization so that we could enrich the conversation with ideas from outside our own particular narrow specializations. And I think on that count, I can immodestly declare a great success, a great victory in that effort, based on public opinion as shared with me during the conference. I think we've come away with a richer understanding of what is entailed with the field, and most importantly, created a foundation from which we can have a more astute and sophisticated and meaningful discussion. So I think that has been a major achievement. And of course, as a researcher, important to me is we've identified areas where we need to do additional research to get a better understanding. And I think now, certainly from the perspectives I've heard, we can do this much more efficiently since we've been able to know what's going on in certain areas. We can rule out certain areas that we may have thought we would investigate, but see that that wouldn't be a very fruitful avenue. And so all of this and all of your time, all of your contributions, your questions, the discussion, the participation in the informal periods has led, I think, to our highest objective, which is science and scholarship in service of society, trying to make people more effective in their individual lives, and together make society of greater value to all those who are participants in it. Thank you very much, and I hope we can continue the discussion in the next room for the next 45 minutes. Thank you.